right? I used to be of the mindset of the person that asked the question. For years, I said people have got to get in the streets and protest. Especially after the financial crisis. You can probably still find videos I made in like 2009, 2010, where I was just telling people, get in the streets, be in the streets, right? And that was the message of the political group I was in, especially around the time of the financial crisis. Be in the streets, organize, be in the streets. And that was the message. Be in the streets. We got to get people in the streets. We got to get people in the streets, right? And I mean, there wasn't as much people in the streets as there is now, right? To be fair, right? I remember 2010, there was a march we built, the Bail Out the People March, and it was a march on Wall Street against the bailout. And Michael Moore promoted it on his website, and I led a delegation of people from Cleveland, and we went to the Bail Out the People March. And Charles Barron of the New York City Council and all kinds of people were there, and it was a communist-led protest on Wall Street, right? That was great. And I remember, there was a big march against, what was it, it was in Pittsburgh, or the World Business Forum, or the World something or other, or the World Bank, or the IMF were meeting in Pittsburgh, and we organized big protests against that. And I was always screaming, we just need more protests, we just need more protests to happen. Well, 2011, all right, it's the 10-year anniversary of 2011 is coming up. PSL. WWP. That was ML. The anniversary of 2011 is coming up. And 2011 was a year which there was a lot of protesting. I mean, and that was a turning point, right? I mean, until then, it made sense why we were always screaming, we need more protesting, we need more protesting. Because really, until about 2011, the country was pretty dead in terms of left-wing activism. 2011 was a turning point. The beginning of the year, you had the Arab Spring starting, that's a complicated phenomenon. But after that, you had in Wisconsin, right? The labor unions occupied the state capitol in Wisconsin. And that was big. I mean, that was the first major labor activist mobilization in a long time, right? The march in Wisconsin. I moved to New York City on my birthday in the end of December in 2010. So we're coming up on the 10-year anniversary of me being here in this city. Wild times. But yeah, so then, 2011, I was in New York City, and while this events in Wisconsin were happening and the workers were occupying the state capitol to fight against anti-union policies, there was a big movement in New York City. Not a big, but a significant mobilization that got no media attention, even though hundreds and hundreds of workers participated. And it was called Bloombergville. And it was an occupation of a corner in the city of New York City against New York City budget cuts. And they had the New York Coalition Against Budget Cuts. I was part of that. I was at Bloombergville. I almost got arrested. I was like the police didn't want to arrest me, and they dragged me out of the building, right? I had, the other people had strapped themselves down, so the police couldn't just kick them out of the building, but I didn't get strapped down soon enough, so the cops just kicked me out of the building, and it was wild. It was just a wild demonstration. I mean, it went on, Bloombergville went on, and then it culminated. The end of it was this like arrest where people got arrested, and and it was like for like a month we occupied a street corner. Thank you for the super chat. We occupied like a street corner in Manhattan, and it was the usual suspects: Trotskyites, anarchists. I was in the Workers' World Party. We were involved. Maoists. I think some of the people that were involved in the what is it called? The Peter Joseph thing. What is it called? The Venus Project. They were there, and it was just this collection of social democrats. Teachers unions were supporting it. The last day there was a big mobilization by the teachers unions to bring like every supporter they had, and it was a big like pro-labor mobilization. I was involved in that, right? A couple months later, you had the beginnings of Occupy Wall Street. I was heavily involved. I went to the planning meetings in Tompkins Square Park, and and then there was Occupy Wall Street, and 2011 was kind of the beginning of when you started to have direct actions and protests in the United States. Now, after that, you got Trayvon Martin, the situation with Trayvon Martin, and then there was protests around Trayvon Martin. You have the hashtag Black Lives Matter. Then you get Ferguson, and then you get Baltimore, and now protesting in the United States happens all the time. I mean, direct actions happen all the time now. But we're not anywhere closer to socialism. And I think that I'm at the point where I don't say we need more people in the streets. People are going to be in the streets. People are already in the streets. That the question of what are you in the streets for is much more pressing. And that, you know, people have no clue. People have no clue. This very, very negative, destructive, woke politics, if you want to call it that, synthetic leftism has really taken control, and that people can be in the streets and without a progressive message, it doesn't really accomplish anything, and it's alienating middle America. And I feel like I have the right to say that. Right now, I wouldn't have the right to say that if I'd never done any activism. When I was in Occupy Wall Street, one thing I hated was all these people who had nothing to do with Occupy Wall Street would find out. I would be at like a family gathering, and some relative would be like, "Oh, you're part of Occupy Wall Street." And then they would say to me, "What Occupy should do is," and then they would give me a spiel, and I would just be like angry, like, "You're not part of this. If you think we should do this, then maybe you should be part of it." And I was always annoyed that every jackass who had watched Rachel Maddow had, "Oh, what Occupy needs to do is," and they had never been part of it. They'd never been in the streets. They'd never been part of it. And they knew exactly what we should do. And I found that to be very, very annoying. I found it to be really, really annoying that there was just this arrogance, "Oh, Occupy needs to do this." Well, I'm sorry. I'm in the middle of this. I've been arrested at Occupy Wall Street a couple times. I mean, can you please assume that maybe I'm doing this and I know more about it than you do? So as somebody who is part of this, I feel like I have the right to say that as somebody who engaged in many direct actions, organized many protests, got arrested a couple times, right? Was in many intense confrontational situations, and I'm somebody who has the right to say that just calling for more direct action, just calling for more protests is not going to cut it. The issue is an ideological one. Nobody knows what they're fighting for. Nobody knows what they're fighting for. Plus, there is no effort to reach the broad masses of people. Basically, the Democratic Party is engaging in Sorelianism. Do folks know who George Sorel is? George Sorel was a very famous syndicalist in France. And his main disagreement with the French Marxists was the Marxists wanted to build a broad party based in communities and trade unions and organizations of people that would fight, against capitalism. Sorel, the syndicalist, said, "Oh, no. History is not made by big movements that are rooted in communities. History is made by heroic groups of men who engage in violence and propaganda of the deed in order to mystically become heroic," right? This is the Sorelian critique, right? And that the development of, Sorelian groups, right? You have the emergence eventually of the black shirts in Italy, and the idea is that we're not going to try to build a group that has a base among the broad population. We're going to build kind of this goon squad, this fighting force that gets things done, and it is like a kick-ass squad, and basically that's kind of what the Democrats are doing. They're basically they've built a Sorelian movement of a group of people who some of them are very smart and dedicated and sincere. Some of them are just lumpen elements. I hate to say that. I sound like an asshole when I say that, but as somebody who was in the park and got arrested, I can tell you there were a lot of people at Occupy who were, stoned out of their minds and, crazy, and, there were lumpen elements, right? And I don't mean black when I say that, by the way. Most of them were white. It was overwhelmingly white, but, people that were, people misuse the word lumpen and think lumpen means black. Lumpen does not mean black. Most black people are not lumpen. Most black people have a job and a family and are just working class people like anybody else. But lumpen refers to declassed elements that engage in criminal behavior that are barely surviving. Right. And, Occupy had a lot of lumpen elements at it. A lot of people, it's funny, when I first worked at, wow, I can just ramble about anything, can't I? When I first worked at a gas station in Cleveland, it was in the middle of a black neighborhood in East Cleveland. I worked at a gas station. And I remember that, it was near a railroad track. And I would see these white kids in the middle of this black neighborhood walk into the gas station covered in mud. They would cover it in mud, and I would wonder, who the hell are these kids? And people at the gas station where I worked, they said, those are railroad kids. And I said, railroad kids? What are railroad kids? And they said, railroad kids. They're kids who ride railroads around. And they said, keep your eye on them because they shoplift. Well, this is true. And I don't know if it's true anymore, but, at the time, this was like 2009, 2010, there were a lot of kids who rode railroads around all the time and lived by criminal means. A lot of them were from suburban families, or, they had like a suburban white middle class background, but they were just kind of declassed elements, right? They talk about the voluntary poor. They were people that usually had some mental health concerns. Oftentimes they were drug addicts, and they would ride the railroads around, and they would shoplift, and they would do drugs, and they were not going to live a normal life. They were railroad kids. And Occupy, the memo went out to every one of these, I don't know, people call them crusties or whatever, and they all showed up. And some of those folks are really, really good people, just have had some mental health problems in their lives. Some of them are not so nice. And a lot of them are just, people that are kind of wandering. And that was, Occupy was like a collection of those folks. There were activists like myself. I was a sincere, dedicated Marxist. I was there. I know a lot of people that were sincere, dedicated Marxists. There were liberals who were just, they saw it on TV, on Rachel Maddow, and they wanted to come join it. And there were these lumpen elements. And the Democrats were kind of using us to be their Sorelian goon squad, right? They would hey, some Republican is speaking here. Who's going to come shut it down with us? And we would all pile into the subway and go down there and shout down this Democrat and act crazy. I mean, we were kind of, and I in a way, I don't, it's complicated, right? And I think that there were some people there who wouldn't have done that. Like, I didn't do that for Democrats, but, some people did. And it was a Sorelian formation. We were going to build this mob of people that are we're going to build this collection of people that will be our hit squad for the Democratic Party. That's kind of what Occupy was. And it was never designed to reach average Americans. It was never designed to be something that average Americans could really relate to, because that wasn't the goal. The goal was to have this group of people who would be the foot soldiers who would push through the Democrats' agenda. Republicans were using the Tea Party that way. The Tea Party was their shock troops, and so the Democrats had Occupy. It was their shock troops, right? And the Tea Party were a bunch of crazy right-wing people, and we were a bunch of crazy left-wing people. And the idea is, whoever's mob shouts the loudest and makes the other side most miserable wins, I guess. It's Sorelianism. It's George Sorel. That's what the Democrats were doing. And so the question about direct actions, I don't think the answer right now is direct actions. Right? I mean, I'm not saying people shouldn't be active. I would never tell anyone not to protest. I would never tell anyone to be politically active. But there needs to be ideology and principles and actual Marxism and anti-imperialism guiding the action. Because at this point, most activism that goes on, most left-wing activism in the United States, is simply Sorelian actions on behalf of the Democrats. And of course, they build a cult, right? Of course, it's like woke politics that no average white person or no average American could ever understand. Of course, it's this crazy, wild, anti-populist stuff, because they're not trying to recruit average Americans to what they're doing. They're trying to build a cult that can be used to force through the agenda of one section of the ruling class, right? And so there's an ideological problem. All kinds of people are getting interested in socialism and Marxism right now. But the Democrats, they don't want socialism. They don't want socialism. Are you kidding? What they want is they want their section of the ruling class to rule. This is Bonapartism, right? And so they have developed Sorelian formations to fight the Republicans, Sorelian formations, right? And that this is ruling class faction versus ruling class faction. This is FBI versus FBI, spy versus spy, CIA versus CIA, deep state versus deep state. And this is what this is, right? And it's going on. And what is desperately needed more than ever is for average Americans, the broad masses of Americans, to come to understand basic Marxism and to be won to a mass populist movement to build a new world. As much as I spent a lot of my time, and I don't regret my activism, but I'm just telling you that the Sorelian formation, we're going to build this cult of fanatics who scream and yell at the rest of society. And that's not going to work. We got to break with Sorelian thinking. So that's a long answer.